Oh, thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Dwi'n hapus iawn o bod yma gyda pawb. It's all right, that's the only Welsh you'll be hearing. I saw several wide eyes over there. He's like, oh, shit, they didn't tell me about that, did they? Oh. Wel, iawn, diolch. A chi? Un dipyn bach oer yn y... Anyway, no, honestly, that is the last Welsh. No, thank you very much. All I said was that I was very, very pleased to be here. As you heard from Sue, she heard me read this at the Hay Festival, and actually the whole piece starts with the Hay Festival, because I wrote this in response to a question that they put out to 30 writers. They said, what would you like to reform? What would you like to change? They asked me fairly late in the day. I think that someone else had dropped out, to be honest. So I was this late replacement, and it meant that a lot of the normal subjects that I would have sort of naturally gravitated towards had already gone. But when I looked at those subjects that I had wanted to speak about, I became very aware of a shared territory. And it's that shared territory that I chose to reform and to write about when I said I would like to reform masculinity and men. And the piece, as I wrote it, is addressed to my two daughters, and it's written in a form of poetry, so it's sort of an epistolary poem. It's a provocation as well, so I try to cover a lot of ground. So there's going to be a lot of stuff coming at you, and fairly quickly as well. But I know that I think we're going to have a chance to return to some of the points in this piece and some of the ideas that I hope that it'll be putting on the table in sessions afterwards. So this is called The Men You'll Meet. So, my daughters, one recently born, the other still in the womb, why is it when asked what I'd like to reform, my first thought was to address that reform to you? Well, for me, to reform means the future, how we might mould it with imagination into a better shape for all. Although I must admit, since I became your father, it's become more specific. For you, my children, my two girls who will grow into women. And maybe that's why, when I cast a reforming eye about our world, our lives, viewing it through your bodies, your minds, I kept seeing at the root of so many of the ills that threaten you, injustice, oppression, violence and pollution, people like me, men. I looked harder and listened too. Put my ear to how we are, what we do, tried to discern the undercurrents of our nurture, the inherited habits and behaviours, which day by day it's so easy to forget are there. And when I did, I heard others who'd seen the same and who were already having this conversation of cause and concern about what we teach and learn when it comes to ideas of what it is to be a man. But I also saw this talk was, in the scheme of things, new, still forming a recent debate despite the age of the issue and its spread about our globe, which at first seemed odd. I mean, the discussion about what women might be, could be, has been running for generations. For decades, women have been embracing change in themselves and society as a path towards a fairer future. As a sex and a gender, they've looked forward, see, and in doing so unlocked the parts of themselves kept from them by society. But men, well, we've hardly been doing the same, but then isn't that always the way? Attention is paid most by those paying the highest price. And for men, living in our systems of patriarchal domination, well, this has rarely, if ever, been them. The white Western male and his equivalent in other cultures have made their worlds to fit them so they might reap its rewards most easily. What are considered to be masculine traits are more highly prized, advantages of life more accessible, their assumed superiority unquestioned in plain sight. So hey, why talk about what might be wrong or unhealthy about masculinity? If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But maybe that's why those conversations I heard when I put my ear to how we are about men and who we might be have finally begun. Because our traditional ideas of being a man are just that, broken, outdated, unhelpful and harmful. And not just to women and the poor, but to everyone, including, I'd say, the majority of men. Which is why I hope I'd be standing here now saying the same if I didn't have daughters but sons. Because regardless of sex, we need to talk, we really do for once, about what men might become. take a lead from feminism and imagine what might they be and how might we as a species come someday to equate a more positive charge with masculinity. So as you can see, what began as a pretty selfish view, how to make the world better for my children, you, and therefore for me, has grown somewhat to encompass the world, just, it has to be said, as a certain variety of traditional or rogue or brittle, toxic, call it what you will, masculinity has. But if we're going to make progress, make no mistake, both are going to have to be addressed at once, the intimate and the universal, the personal and the global, how men are one-to-one with each other and with women and children, but also how the idea of a man sits across our cultures, religions and nations. Because neither can happen alone. The personal informs the political, the domestic, the public, and vice versa. A spiral of influence that tightens over time. So it's that spiral we need to slow, unwind. The way what we teach about gender becomes who we are, until it feels like nature, normal, when really mostly it's not. It's nurture. Which is why this tightening spiral can be our solution too. What did Larkin say? Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like an ocean shelf. Thanks, Larkin. Well, yes, but an ocean shelf slopes the other way too. And we have to believe that instead of a deepening, a shallowing of inherited pain is also in our power. That what we pass on is what we become, for good as well as bad. Otherwise, how else is progress made? So that's my stall, my daughters. The dominant perceptions of masculinity across the globe and cultures is harming us all, men, women, girls, boys, humans, animals, flora and fauna. But until recently this hasn't been addressed. Why? Because those same patriarchal ideas inform the systems we live in, until those perceptions aren't seen as choices at all, but just how things are, like the air or the tides or the shedding of leaves from a tree. But to let that be, in the face of the evidence I've seen, well, that doesn't seem fair or wise or good enough to me. Before I continue, let's get some things clear, what I am and am not talking about here. Firstly, I know that there are many kinds of men, and most, I hope, want to be good. And there is a degree of nuance in our being, gay, straight, somewhere in between, the geek, the muso, the sportsman, the stay-at-home dad. But in general, across the world, the rules of being a man still well rule. As a recent Samaritan's report has put it, men still compare themselves when it comes to masculinity to a gold standard, which prizes above all power, control, invincibility. So much of their being is taken up with trying to prove their value and worth, not through being who they are, but through what they do. We expect boys to be boisterous, perhaps, rather than bookish, fathers to be earners more than carers, and for boys and men to be less attuned emotionally than girls or women. Which brings me to sex and gender, which, and it's so important to hammer this home, aren't the same thing at all. Sex, you see, is about the chromosome and biological fact. You both have XX, while boys have XY, and along with those pairs, you, more estrogen, they, testosterone. Because of this, our hardware, as many will jump to tell you, isn't wired exactly the same. And I see how that could be true, I really do. I have a punch bag hanging in our barn. Sometimes when frustrated, angry, I like to hit it again and again, and then I feel better. Your mother, however, she doesn't need to do the same. If she's having those emotions, she'll go somewhere quiet, alone, or speak to her own mother on the phone. All that said, at the same time, I know many women out there who'd rather ease their frustration by hitting the bag, and many men who do the same by going somewhere quiet, alone, like your mum. And this is what the surveys, the studies now show, that in infant males and females, there's much more overlap than difference. And yes, those chromosomes govern us to a certain extent, but that extent is more limited than we like to think. And so no reason to justify unfair treatment or to cut down on choices for one group or another just because slightly more men hit the bag and slightly more women want to talk to their mother. Because whatever our hardware, it's our software that runs us. And that, well, that isn't written by genes, but experience, by example, in the pressures, both overt and subtle, that tell us from early in the cradle what it is not to be male or female, but a man or a woman. Gender, you see, by definition, is a myth-made beast. Created upon a sketch of biological difference, yes, but then fleshed out and given movement, action with the stories, habits, and often prejudiced that most benefits those holding the reins and the power. To put it simply, sex, a biological category, is what we are, and gender, a cultural category, is what we feel, think, or are told a man or a woman should be. What are the attributes of masculine or feminine? What the expectations, behaviour, duties, rights and roles? Chromosomes don't change, but thoughts and feelings do, which means that ideas and perceptions of gender can too, and often have. Not that long ago, for your great-great-great-grandmother, having a womb meant she couldn't vote, take part in politics, or expect to do the same jobs as a man. Now, the both of you, exactly the same kind of biological female, aren't the same kind of woman, because you can. The playing field is still far from level, and God knows there's loads more to be done, but in terms of imagining themselves out of culture's constraining version of their gender, then there's no doubt it's men 0 and women 1. Although, of course, that's another problem, that versus trap into which I've just fallen, the way in which from early on boys and girls are routinely viewed in opposition, troublesome v compliant, active v passive, loud v quiet. Of course, masculinity's been fluid too, flexing over the ages and time. 200 years ago, the power suit was a wig and tights and high heels, while for the Spartans, to be a real man meant sleeping with one was part of the deal. But since the agricultural revolution, well, there's been barely any change. Perhaps in parenting we've made the greatest strides, although nowhere near enough again, but the baseline of what it means to be a man, that's pretty much remained the same. American social scientists in the 1970s came up with 4 rules of Western masculinity. No sissy stuff, be a big wheel, a sturdy oak, and give 'em hell. Now, 5 decades on, for most of the globe, these markers haven't moved, which is pretty crap. I mean, I don't want the men you'll meet to be restricted by these rules. I want them to be informed by and have more options than that. In fighting against discrimination over the same 5 decades, women have managed to move into more traditionally male roles, which, let me stress, has been only for the good, and the pressure for that movement is being kept up, as it should, encouraging girls to study STEM or play rugby, aim for the boardroom, the Oval Office, the director's chair, the moon, to question what society has told them makes a woman. But where's the equivalent movement for boys? The encouragement to broaden the bandwidth of what it means to be a man, to study the arts, be a full-time father, to value communication over anger. There are groups, attempts on a local scale, but on a global it isn't there. And as a result, the options of what being a girl can mean are much broader than those for a boy. Firstly, because of feminism, but also, it has to be said, because society still values the manly attributes the girls acquire over the feminine trait instead. For those who question that, ask them this, a scenario courtesy of Grayson Perry in his book, The Descent of Man. A 6-year-old girl with cropped hair walks down the street wearing jeans and waving a sword or a gun. What do you think? A tomboy, right? A little girl having fun. A 6-year-old boy walks just behind with long hair, wearing a skirt and waving a wand. What do you think? A sissy? A victim? I mean, don't his parents worry how they'll all have it in for him? So who's promoting this narrow definition of man? Well, just about everyone. Advertising, toy shops, fathers, brothers, films, games, our language, the internet, schools, sisters, mothers. Boys will be boys. When do we say that? Not when they've solved a problem or painted a picture or helped someone. More likely when they've been too rough, misbehaved, or maybe even cut back on their reading, because it's easier that way, isn't it? To give in to the idea that gender is fixed, so all we can do is roll over and accept it. At which point you may ask, why not? You've been banging on about this problem of men, Dad, but what exactly is it? At which point can I highlight we're calling it just that, a problem? Not an issue, not a crisis, as the papers often like it to say as such, to quote once again from Grayson Perry's mouth, is like saying that racism was in crisis in the American South. But back to your question. Well, daughters, I think there's more than one issue, but as problems often are, they're linked, threaded within masculinity's narrow definition. But let's start with this. Imagine yourself an alien, new on the earth. and in one fluid glance you survey our world. This in numbers is part of what you see just here in this country. 90% of violent crime is committed by men. 75% of all crime the same. 95% of prison inmates are men again. 98% of sexual offences are committed by men. 45% of women have experienced domestic abuse, sexual assault or stalking. A man brought up in a house where such activity happens is 3 to 4 times more likely to become an abuser himself. In a survey in the US, where teenage girls and boys were asked which of all their fears was the greatest one, the girls' most common answer was being raped, assaulted or killed. The boys, being ridiculed, the subject of laughter. So Larkin, perhaps not just man passing on misery to man, but also creating it for women. And daughters, now I hope you can see why with all the world to reform, I chose people like me. You cast your alien eyes wide across the globe. Every example of systemic oppression you find is designed and governed by men. The reckless despoiling of the planet, that too is dominated by them, as for that matter is the doubting of the consequences of the same. Violent extremism of every religion, Christian, Muslim, again, overwhelmingly stoked and devised, and crimes in its name committed by men. The greed-driven, overly risky financial models that crash, bringing austerity and ruin, yep, you guessed it, the architects and cultures of these also rooted in traditional masculinity. By now, your alien jaw is on the floor. This is extraordinary. To call a spade, from what you can tell, nearly all this planet's wrong is done by 50% of the population, by the half that's male, and that the mistreatment of women and girls at the hands of men, as President Carter once said, is, in terms of human rights abuse on the planet, number one. But then you realise at least the source is clear and therefore also the solution. Surely you think, opening up your single alien ear, this must be the talk on everyone's lips. Look at all this harm that men have done, but at least we now know it's done by them. So hooray, we can roll up our sleeves and sort this thing. You listen. Nothing. A few whispers on the wind, the odd lone voice raising the cry. But on the whole, the talk around issues of identity seemed to be about mostly others instead. Women, as we've already said, minorities, races, sexualities, but men in the shape of those who have shaped our world. The figures are there, plain to see, as are they, but the debate to tackle them is strangely empty. You raise your alien eyebrows in surprise. Maybe I've missed something, you surmise. It's like dodgy rhyme, that. So you look again, but what you see just confuses you more, because this issue of men, it seems, is hurting them too, whether rich or poor. Violence, for example, it's now clear to you, is a male disease, but its victims are men as well as their female partners, daughters and wives. In the UK, you learn, men are 80% of the victims of violent attack and 85% of those committing suicide. And that, a death by their own hand, is the single biggest killer for males under 45. You stop to take that in. Surely that, if nothing else, is a canary in the mine. But it doesn't stop there, because men, you see, despite undoubtedly reaping the advantages of a male-based system in wages, opportunities, power and authority, are still beyond violence, being hurt by masculinity. 80% of rough sleepers are men, for one. Or here's another. 4 times more likely as boys to suffer with difficulties of behaviour or emotion, and 3 times more likely to be excluded from school. Then, on the more granular level that's harder to measure, the way a constrained vision of masculinity can be detrimental to their happiness and well-being, and of course their relationships with women. Long hours in the office, short hours with the family, increased loneliness, fewer close friends, a decline in the jobs that once gave them identity. In response, I'm sure some will say, hey, this isn't all down to the gender roles that we project, and of course there are other factors too. But I still say the masculinity we have now, it doesn't leave men well equipped for when that version of manhood has failed for them. Because think about it. You're raised to be dominant, competitive, the breadwinner, and a winner in the workplace too, yet also having put the emphasis on power, physical and earning, and neglected emotional learning. When things go south, so does the man, humiliated, unable to talk, retreating into the reticence, risk and violence that's always been part of their schooling. The Samaritans again. In a marriage breakdown, it is much more likely to lead to suicide for men than women. Or as Rebecca Asher says in her book, Man Up, Men who are socially excluded, unqualified and uncared for fare much worse than their female counterparts. And for me, that goes to the matter's heart. If the view of your gender you inherit is narrow and built on myths from an age not yours, when it doesn't work out and you're left with no power, status, authority, all of which you've been told is what makes you you, what do you fall back on? Options are what you need. Another way to be, to navigate your recovery, and for traditional man, as prescribed as he is, they're few. So daughters, this alien you've been pretending to be, they're off now. They've seen enough. They're not sticking around. But before they go, they take a global view of what all this might cost. Literally in money, it's a lot. Male violence in the UK alone costs around 30 billion a year. So imagine that multiplied across the continents and nations. In lost lives and unlived potential, again, as we've seen, the cost is too much. And what about the planet itself, the drivers of climate change, aggressive resource extraction, a profit-driven short-termism, and then in response to the threat, an oddly irrational inaction? Would the same have happened under the eyes of more balanced men, or if the reins of energy were in the hands of women? Okay, the alien is off, it's time to go, but we, my children, we're still here. We can't just observe then run. I mean, the boys of now and the future are the men you'll meet, so I'm guessing you'd like something done. All well and good, Dad, being so down on the state of men, but if it's really so bad and you're so smart, then what's your solution? Good question. Well, for starters, this. Have the conversation, and not just the what, how we talk about it. That in itself would be a great leap forward, be inquiring, ambitious, aware of what gender is and is doing for all, and where we have it too. In festivals, great, but also in the media, soaps, pubs, films, and most importantly, I'd say, in school classrooms and halls. Maybe statutory lessons for boys and girls about what's expected of them as men and women and why that's the case and should it be. Let them discuss those stats I shared with you and see how they'd imagine a different way forward. Let them talk it through, not just in terms of what's gone wrong, but also the benefits, the rewards. As part of this conversation, the group's already having it now, like Great Men here in Great Britain, or Men Can Stop Rape in the United States, should be supported by governments to expand the work they do in taking alternative visions of being a man to boys and young men, because new role models should be encouraged everywhere, at home, in the media, and in schools, of course, too. Why not a quota or a target for men as teachers from infant to secondary school? Or national programs of male mentoring and fostering, a concerted effort to put the shoulder to the wheel to make a better man. It's something that already happens one-to-one. When asked about a strong man in their life, it's interesting how many men describe not someone of physical or commanding power, but rather a man who's given them counsel, advice, or offered compassion. Let's listen to that quiet message. Which brings me to rites of passage. Every culture and every time has had one for men, a moment of transition where time is given to thinking and acting out who you want to become. So where is ours now? There are maybe two of a legal kind, I'd say both informal, sport and the army. For some, these can do the trick, offer a sense of purpose, identity, and most importantly, belonging. But both are based in easy certainty, win, lose, train and obey, and in all the fundamentals of trad man too. So what happens when they end? I've worked with men conditioned by both and seen how vulnerable they can be when the physical, for whatever reason, fails. Emotionally, these most manly of men can seem like children, unschooled in the blurred lines of the world, unsure of how to be or what to do, emerging from landscapes of sexism into a more complex world where often it's a woman in their lives who pulls them through. Here's another thing that has to happen. Absolute equality. At home, work, across society. Why? Well, if boys see and experience a patriarchy, if they observe an assumed male superiority, then we can't even get out of the starting blocks. Because this is part of the narrow bandwidth. If men are dominant, then with that comes a shopping list of other constrictive traits, being the provider, power, authority, sexism, a reliance on certainty, strength. As the anthropologist Margaret Mead once said, every time we liberate a woman, we liberate a man. And I'd say the opposite of that is true as well, because if we do, hopefully, then men will see there's nothing to fear. Equality isn't and shouldn't be a zero-sum game. It's not a seesaw when one goes up, the other goes down. No, it's balance. Holding that seesaw in buoyant space, alive with possibility, not anchored at one end and suspended at the other. But what I hear you say about us, the children, when we come along, men and women become father and mother, doesn't that put a spanner in the equality works? Well, yes, it always has done, but doesn't have to. If we want a better society, then it's in our power to shape it. The ocean shelf slopes up as well, remember. So to start with, subsidised universal childcare across the board for all preschool children and paid equal parental leave. Being involved as a dad needs to become the norm, the choice of who cares and how much made within each family, not by society. For this to happen, men need to be not just invited to take their leave, adopt flexible hours, but also expected. How does that happen? Well, apart from changing the culture of work to adopt this, also in stressing the benefits. I mean, it's a win-win situation. Children experience and see men in a caring role, while it's been proved in the Nordic countries where this is already on the move, men are happier, more socially connected, more emotionally stable if they feel they can exchange the stress from above of putting food on the table, for caring for their children, for providing for them not just with money but also with time, emotion and love. A couple of other equality points. One, the concept needs to have backing in the courts. Laws like the new bill passed in Iceland that punishes unequal pay. Two, our government should lead by example. Set a female MP target of 50% in Parliament. Okay, I'm going to bring this to a close now, but before I go, a couple of more ambitious ideas. I mean, what's the point of imagining reform if you don't let yourself dream? So here's one. The de-gendering of personality traits. What would it be like if we stopped identifying aggression with men, emotions and communication with women, to allow boys and girls to grow up free of expectation as to who their sex means they should be, to organise their roles in life, in relationships, as they see fit, to be people who are many things and types and who share perhaps more than we think, to do away with the idea of girls' jobs and boys' jobs, thank you, Mrs. May, and say to our children, follow your instincts, your wishes, your ideas, free from prescription or boundaries or fears. For the time being, though, in terms of men, how about we at least try expanding on the traits we traditionally associate with them? To protect and to provide, for example. What if we were to man up on this one, to extend our vision of what is provision, protection beyond our own tribe, to see it in terms of our species instead, until to do either in such a way that somewhere else, someone else is left unprotected or unprovided just isn't manly at all. If we follow this logic, then environmentalists and climate activists, never usually spoken of in the most masculine terms, should be the guyest guys of us all, protecting the whole planet, and in doing so trying to provide for everyone. Wow, now that's a man. Lifting his eyes from his own back door to take in the globe, to protect and provide for us all. And what about bravery? We teach our boys to be physically brave. Why not emotionally too? And strength. Is just physical enough anymore to survive in the modern world? Or shouldn't a man be strong in well-being, empathy and mental health too? I could go on, but you get the gist. Expand the traits of each gender until, well, they just meet. And then what do you get? People. Full of difference, yes, but humans all the same, raising their game. So daughters, let's end on a vision of what men and masculinity might be by the time you're my age, 42, 43. A person with chromosomes of X and Y, for whom power without compassion is no power at all, for whom strength has been decoupled from domination, for whom to be fit, healthy means in body and mind and emotion, for whom oppression is equated with fear in the oppressor, aggression with failure on the part of the aggressor, for whom the ability to be vulnerable makes him strong, as does that to be unsure, uncertain, even wrong, a male allowed to contain Whitman's multitudes, who has cared for and witnessed the growth of his children, or who, if he has none, is still involved as mentor or teacher with the next generation, because not to be would be, well, unmanly, who actually would no longer be familiar with that word, but would in its place have another for whatever not being a human might mean. I know, I dream. But as your father, that's part of my job. Every parent wants to pass on something better, and so far we're not doing so great. A property and Europe, a fair economy, the climate, I see it all slipping out of your grip. But if we could pass on this vision, or even just a taste of it, for you to later form, then that would be getting something done. To know that one day the two of you might read this, each with a man or a woman by your side, who'll look on in disbelief that it was ever necessary to give such a speech. Who'll put their arms around you as you put yours around them, all of you beyond your sex, your own person, as you wonder how it was we could have been so mad. Shaking your heads as you walk away, saying with a smile, each to the other, silly old dad. Thank you very much. Just about. It's quite nice, isn't it? Thank you.